Shalom, how's everyone doing? Today is day 37 of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. We'll be learning Siman Seif Zayin. Let's begin. Tzoa yevesha kol kach, if you have tzoa that's very dry, shehi nefrechas al yedei glila, that it will crumble if you roll it. Harehi kafar, it doesn't have a din of tzoa anymore. Rather, we look at it like dust, so you could say devarim shebikdusha by it. V'hu shelo yeheva reich ra, unless it still has a bad smell. Aval em nikra shamach masakur. Let's say it like froze because of the cold. Kevan sheyechola lachzor lekan musa bizman hachom, since it will be able to go back to its original state of tzoa when it becomes warm. Adayin shem tzoa, it still is considered tzoa, and you couldn't say devarim shebikdusha by it. The tzoa sheniskasik b'shelag, tzoa that's covered in snow, chashuv kisoy, is considered a covering, and you could say devarim shebikdusha. Fine. So obviously we've been discussing the halachos of saying devarim shebikdusha in the presence of tzoa. So the question is, what's considered tzoa? Is there any point that tzoa becomes so dry that it's not like tzoa anymore? It loses its status. So that's really what the Kitzur is talking about, and he makes a few points. The first point, he says that there is something called tzoa yevesha, tzoa that's very dry, and this really comes from the Gemara in Maseches Brachos Daf Chafei. If you look in the Gemara there, it gives two different opinions about when tzoa becomes dry, and then you could then say devarim shebikdusha. One opinion is, if it's so dry that if you would throw the tzoa, it would actually crumble, that is going to be fine. That's one opinion. The other opinion is, if it would crumble just by rolling it, then that is considered not tzoa. So, if you look in the Rishonim, there's a question which one of those shitos are the more machmir shita. But when it comes to halacha, right, the mechaber paskins like this throwing thing, that the getter is throwing it and crumbling, but the Ramah says the getter is rolling it. That if that's what would make it crumble, then it does not have a din of tzoa. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two is something the Magen Avram brings up. The Magen Avram says, like, sometimes you have tzoa, and it's just so cold outside that the tzoa freezes and it becomes like a stone. Right, so the Magen Avram asks, it's like a stone right now, right? It probably doesn't have a bad smell. It's so hard, does that have a din of tzoa? So he says, maybe we just look at it like what it is right now, right? When it becomes cold, it freezes, so maybe we should just look at the thing like a stone. But his maskana seems to say that, no, since it has the ability to go back to its original state, if it gets warm again, therefore, just because it froze, that would not make it lose the shem tzoa, as opposed to the case we had before. If it's crumbly, right, that at that point it loses its shem tzoa and it could never get the shem tzoa again. However, in this case, since it's very possible for it to have the shem tzoa again, it would still be a problem to say devarim shebikdusha. And as the Pri Megadim points out, since we're dealing with a deoraisa here, right, there's a deoraisa idea of not saying devarim shebikdusha by tzoa, therefore we should be machmir. Okay, and the last thing he says, which is something interesting, he says snow could be a covering. Snow could be a covering, which is interesting because, right, if you look at the Gemara, right, just to recap something we've learned so far, right, you're not allowed to say devarim shebikdusha in the presence of tzoa. But one exception of that is that if the tzoa is covered, you're actually able to say devarim shebikdusha. Right, the case the Gemara has, and it says even if it's covered with like a glass box, so you could literally see it, but a covering is a covering. Okay, so what's considered a covering? So the Gemara talks about spit. Could you just spit on the tzoa, and that would be considered a covering? So the Gemara says, yes, but it has to be rok ava. It has to be very thick spit. Thin spit would not work. So the Rishonim asks, what's the difference between thick? What's the difference between thin? So the Ritva explains in Maseches Brachos, and he says, Shemash tzarach rok ava. The reason why it has to be thick spit, mishum shehu mechusa osa ad kidei shetzoa eina neres kedarka. Right, thin spit won't do anything. It's going to look exactly the same. Thick spit, it's going to change the appearance of the tzoa. Right, so the covering has to do something that changes the appearance of the tzoa. That's what the covering has to be. Right, so that's why if you look in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Ayin Vav, Sif Vav, and you take a look at the Magen Avram, the Magen Avram asks, what about water? So would water be a good covering? Right, let's say you have tzoa, could you just pour water on it, and that will do the job? So he says no, because we have this getter. If it looks the same, then that's not considered a covering. So he asks, what about this case of the glass? Let's say you have a glass cover, you cover it, it looks exactly the same, because it is exactly the same. No, because Tehasim Kitzur Ma'al Yehu. Right? The reason we're asking about like this water stuff and the spit stuff, because these things aren't really good coverings. These are not vessels, they can't really cover things. So therefore we have a question, okay, even though it's not a good covering, but if it actually looks different, that would do the job. But if something's a real covering, it's a real vessel, obviously that will do that will cover it. So if you look at the Nosei Kelim here, right, you take a look at the Shari Tshuva, he brings up this snow case, right? To snow work, because we have an idea that water is not a good covering for tzoa, because it doesn't change the way that tzoa looks in any way. So water is not a good covering. It's snow, right? So the question really depends on, it's probably the same question we had before, right? Let's say we have like the question we had by the tzoa, right? The tzoa was frozen, but at some point it won't freeze. So therefore it should still be tzoa. So maybe we should say the same thing here, right? This snow will turn into water at some point, and once it's water, it's clear it's not a good covering. So maybe snow won't be a covering at all. However, if you look at most of the Nosei Kelim here, and obviously what the Kitzur says, he says snow is actually a covering. Because what's the difference? Why by the case of the tzoa, where it's going to turn back to original state, it's not that's not considered a change? Because right, we want for there to be a defined moment that this tzoa becomes not so anymore, and that never happens, right? The freezing doesn't do anything, because we know it's just going to go back to its original state. However, when it comes to covering tzoa, when it comes to just a cover, we just look at it practically, right? The pasuk says, "V'chisisa seyasecha," make sure your tzoa is covered. Does the snow do a good job? Is it covered? Yeah, you can't see it anymore. It's a good job. We don't really care that it's going to go back to its original state of water. Okay, go ahead.